For 3D printing, we have a lot of software that we use. Obviously, we have our slicers, and then if we're doing design, we use CAD software as well. But on top of that, there are some software that's, I guess, technically optional, but can come in very handy. So I'm going to cover some of that. First of all, I recommend having Notepad, Notepad++, and with that, what you can do is by opening the plugin admin and just downloading the npp ftp, Notepad++ ftp, installing that. You can edit your printer.cfg files on your Raspberry Pi remotely. So you just open the window and then add a profile for your 3D printer. So let's name it 410, and you just type in your IP and then connect, and we should be able to edit the file. Now I edit my profile, so with this I just connect to the 410. This will ask about the key on the first time you try to connect. It's okay, you can trust your own printer obviously, so just click yes. And there we go, we connected, and from here we can edit our printer.cfg. In my case, I'm using Mainsail, which means the printer.cfg is in Clipper config. Normally it's just in the Pi under home. So we can open that and edit it here. Another piece of software that I highly recommend, which is not very well known in the hobby space, is the Linux file system program by Paragon Software. If you've inserted any of the SD cards that's formatted for Linux, the ones we use on Raspberry Pi for example, you've probably noticed that you can't access the same files on Windows. You can only access certain files on Linux, so either you have to use something like SCP, FTP, or VNC, or some other weird protocol to get access to your files, and that also assumes that your Raspberry Pi is working just fine. With this software you can edit all of your files from Windows natively, and yeah, it works pretty well. Now this is technically a paid software, but just like WinRAR, this doesn't really expire if you download the free version. Once your free trial expires, all that happens is your file transfer speeds are reduced by some amount, which I haven't even noticed, but I assume they're not lying. It slows down somewhat, but again, in our cases we usually just edit text files, so it doesn't really matter. And again, with this software you can edit a lot of the files there. And this saved my config on my V2, for example. I should probably mention this as an example. I use enclosure plugin on Octoprint and use that to control relays for my lighting and stuff like that. Now I accidentally inputted the GPIO pin to that plugin using board mode instead of BCM mode, so I entered a different number, and that for some reason led to my Raspberry Pi not even booting. And yeah, it probably what was happening was it was probably trying to access a GPIO pin that on the hardware level is configured for Wi-Fi or something like that, so they overlapped and it never worked. At least that's my assumption. But yeah, the thing is, I couldn't save my printer.cfg, I couldn't save my Octoprint settings, I couldn't save anything if I just reinstalled all of this stuff. So only way for me to get access to that file was using this, and using this I edited the config file of Octoprint, and plugins config are also saved in the same file. So I just fixed the GPIO pin, and magically something that should have honestly just died, I saved that with this software. So again, this thing can come in very handy and I highly recommend it. And again, all of the software I mentioned will be linked in the description below, so again you can find it on their website. Also I also recommend using Etcher. Now this is probably something you know if you use, for example, OctoPi, but for some people you just install something like Raspbian or Raspberry Pi OS in their new name and just install your Octoprint or Clipper or whatever else directly. For example, the default installation method until fairly recently for Mainsail was to just start on a Raspbian Lite and install Clipper, then Moonraker, then Mainsail on top of that. And for that you don't need Etcher, but when you want to install something like OctoPi or any other image, you can use Etcher to again etch the files necessary to your SD card. It's a pretty useful software, so if you're not aware of this, again I highly recommend this. And speaking of OctoPi, I recommend something like Octoprint or Mainsail or even Fluid. I haven't tested Fluid, by the way, it's just a similar thing to Mainsail. I'll explain them. Octoprint is a generic piece of software that can connect with any firmware. For example, here this is Octoprint. This is Octoprint's interface with a theme applied to it. It's lighter colored normally. With this you can select your files, print, send terminal commands, etc. You can do pretty much everything you would need to do from the screen or from a connected computer. Octoprint can do that. But if you're using Clipper, there are also other alternatives. There is Mainsail, which is developed by the Voron team. It's a pretty lightweight piece of software. So for Octoprint and OctoPi, which is just an image of that installed on Raspbian, for that you need a decently powerful Raspberry Pi, so you can't run that on a Raspberry Pi Zero. With Mainsail, for example, and probably with Fluid as well, you can run it on Raspberry Pi Zero, and that's what I'm running on my Voron Zero. So this is the interface from Mainsail. Now I should probably mention that this is still in development and there are still some bugs with the UI, etc. But overall it still works pretty well, and the installation of it is pretty well documented as well. Plus there is the option of using MainsailOS. I didn't open the tab, but I'll link it in the description, which just like OctoPi, you just etch that into a SD card and it just runs, and that's an easy way of installing if you don't want to go through the step of manually installing each component. And yeah, again, as I said, this you can do pretty much everything you need with Mainsail as well if you don't need plugins, and yeah, it works really well. And Fluid is a similar alternative. It's built on the same API and same interface JavaScript thing, and it's just a slightly different interface. Again, I haven't tested this personally, but it should just work. I don't see a reason why it wouldn't work. So if you prefer this look, this is also an option. Also for Voron 2 people, another thing I recommend, which is not very well known, which is I guess technically software because it's firmware, but anyway, it's just worth mentioning in this video as well, is the BetterBootLoader for SKR 1.3. With the SKR 1.3, the way we usually flash Clipper onto that is by putting the firmware file onto the micro SD card, and that works, but that also means that you have to rotate your V2, unplug the micro SD cards, put the files on it and insert them back into the SKRs, etc. It's just more complicated than it needs to be. So what this does, again, this is developed by one of the Voron team members, Arxine, and what this does is this flashes a new bootloader to your SKR 1.3, and with that, what that bootloader allows you to do is to load your firmware through USB, so you don't actually have to disassemble things to flash a new firmware from now on if you do this. The way you do this is pretty simple. You just download it, rename it to firmware.bin, just like you do with the Clipper firmware, and put the SD card in your SKR and wait something like 30 seconds. Well, they say 10 seconds on this page. I like to be safe, so I wait like 30 seconds and then hit the reset button on your SKR, and from that moment you should be able to use the Clipper's flash thing, the Clipper's flash command, and flash the firmware through USB without actually having to ever touch the SD card ever again. So this is pretty useful as well, and I recommend for this for all the V2 people and actually V1 as well people out there. This is pretty useful. Not sure if this supports SKR 1.4, by the way. It's not listed here, but yeah, it might be. Just ask on the Discord if you want to be sure, because technically doing this can break your SKR if you don't do it right. But if you do it right, there is no reason to worry. So yeah, just an FYI. And I should also mention I'm running this without any issues, and I know plenty of other people who run this without any issues as well. So yeah, this is not risky if you do it right, but if you do it wrong, you will break your SKR. And lastly, I wanted to give a shout out to PuTTY as well. Now on Windows, this PuTTY was one of the few ways of SSHing into your Raspberry Pi. Now you can do it natively through PowerShell, and you don't need additional software for this. But I just like using PuTTY. It's a simpler UI, and you can just input your IP address and connect directly without going through the command line of Windows. And yeah, it's just a quicker way of connecting. I don't know, maybe it's just a habit thing, but yeah, it's pretty handy piece of software. So again, for SSHing into your Raspberry Pi, I can recommend PuTTY. And yeah, I guess that's it for this video. I wanted to highlight a few pieces of software that I found useful. So yeah, I hope this video was useful to you as well, and yeah, I hope you found it useful. If you did, please leave me a like down below, and thanks for watching.